Good morning, everybody. We're here today. We're privileged to have Paul Dwyer, a personal friend of mine and a brilliant immigration attorney in New York City. His information is pauldwyerlaw.com. Go visit his website. But he's got over 20 years of experience in asylum law. And he's my go-to person as far as whatever questions I may have on asylum. The other day we were talking about all the recent obstacles that the Trump administration has created really in obtaining asylum in this country. And Paul said something interesting to me that he thought that for all intents and purposes, really asylum from our southern border is no longer a viable route. So today, I wanted to ask him about that and talk and have him explain what he meant by that statement. So good morning, Paul. How are you?
Hi, good morning, Ali. Thank you for the introduction.
You're welcome. How are you doing today?
Good, isolating here in the middle of Manhattan, as isolated as that can be. So how are you?
Okay, very cool. Very cool. So just diving right in, as far as asylum, what did you mean? What are the issues that you're concerned about as far as seeking asylum through our southern border?
So I'm going to answer that with it, and I'm going to try to avoid being, unnecessarily kind of technical or getting too much into weeds about asylum procedures. But you do have to have a little bit of understanding of what the process was. So typically, people who are from Central America or from Mexico, or need anybody who transits through Mexico and tries to enter the US through the southern border in order to claim asylum in the US, so people either enter at a port of entry, right? Like let's say San Isidro or El Paso, or else they cross the border illegally, and then let's say they're apprehended by a border protection, a customs, a CBP officer. And at that point, they'll be asked if they have any fear of being returned. And if they say, yes, they do, then they have an initial screening interview, which is called a credible fear interview. And then if they're found to have a credible fear of persecution if they're returned to their country, then they are, scheduled for a further proceeding inside the US, and they remain in the US until their cases are adjudicated. So commencing a couple of years ago, the current administration put a number of procedures in place that affected how this would happen. And so the first one is a procedure called metering. And it's a strange word, and it doesn't seem to have any relationship to the actual procedure itself. But really what that meant is that people who tried to enter the country, people who tried to make claims for asylum, having been caught by CBP officers crossing the border, would be sent back to Mexico and said, you have to go and make your claim for asylum at a port of entry. So you had thousands upon thousands and thousands of people clogging up the ports of entry, making claims for asylum. And the administration put a program into place, or a procedure called metering, whereby you had to enter your name in a book. It's very primitive. It's actually a physical book where the person's name and details are written down. And then they basically wait in line, or they used to wait in line for a date to come up, and that could be months, that they would go there every day and they would check to see if their name was being called. And if not, they would just wait there in this semi-transient sort of way.
Essentially taking a number.
Essentially taking a number and waiting online. And then a second, so that's the metering one. So then there was a second procedure called the Migrant Protection Protocol, or MPP. It's also known as Remain in Mexico. And it's very much like it suggests. So let's say you get through phase one, right? Let's say you get through the metering thing, that your claim is accepted, and you're scheduled for a hearing before a judge. So what the Remain in Mexico policy says is that's fine, but while you're waiting for your hearing before a judge, you stay in Mexico. And then you show up on the border on the day of the hearing with your hearing notice, and you're taken to a tent which houses the temporary immigration courts that they've set up to deal with the MPP cases. and a judge hears your case, and if they don't finish it, or if it's continued to another day, then you're sent back to Mexico, and then you come back months later to continue your case. And because the border towns in Mexico are so dangerous, people end up staying in temporary accommodations hundreds of miles from the border.
Is this just for Mexicans or for everybody in the world?
For everybody arriving at the southern border.
Yeah.
People arriving by land at the southern border, registering claims for asylum. So it doesn't matter if you're from Mexico, if you're from India, whatever, if you arrive at the southern border seeking asylum, you remain in Mexico while your case is being decided. Then there's a third procedure put in place called the Safe Third Country procedure, which requires anybody who is, again, who arrives by land at the southern border and who registers a claim for asylum, also has to show, to be eligible for asylum, that they have filed an application for asylum and had it denied in any country to which they transited through. So people from Guatemala who would have to transit through Mexico to get there would have to show that they applied for asylum in Mexico. People from Honduras and El Salvador who would have to travel through Guatemala in order to get to Mexico would have to show that they applied for asylum in Guatemala and it was denied, and then that they applied for asylum in Mexico and also that it was denied. And same for people from any other country who transit through Mexico would have to show that they had applied for asylum in whatever countries they had come through en route to the Mexican border. And there are numerous exceptions to that, but they are difficult and they have very high standards of proof. They're very, very technical, and many people may not know that they're eligible for exceptions to that. And the Safe Third Country really, I think, was like a major nail in the coffin of asylum eligibility at the southern border. And then finally, we have the asylum cooperative agreements, which are agreements that the Trump administration has entered into with the governments of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, in which asylum applicants from any of those countries can be returned to one of the other countries. So if you're from Guatemala and you're seeking asylum in the US, the government can decide that they're not even going to entertain your asylum application, but instead they're going to send you to Honduras. And Honduras has to accept the person. And vice versa, if you're from El Salvador, you claim asylum, the government can decide that you should be sent to Guatemala, and then they send you to Guatemala and you're stuck there. So those four programs, by and large, have been upheld by the appellate courts, including the Supreme Court. They haven't all reached the Supreme Court, but those that have been upheld. And so I think that we are stuck with these certainly for the duration of the Trump administration. And I think that when we have a new government in place, it's going to be extremely difficult to dismantle effectively these roadblocks that have been set up for asylum. And so I don't think that we are going to return to to how it was pre-Trump.
So why not? I mean, why couldn't a new president and a new Congress set up new procedures in not necessarily reverting to the old ways, but kind of fixing the issues that have come up since the the new procedures have been put in place?
Well, because I think, first of all, you're going to have a very, very resistant agency. So the Department of Homeland Security has a number which is responsible for the administration and implementation and execution of the immigration laws, has a number of different component sub-agencies. One of those is ICE, and one of those is CBP, Customs and Border Protection. And I think it will be very, very difficult to get the rank and file members of ICE and CBP to go on board with reverting back to a system that was more respectful of the rights of asylum seekers and the ability to be able to process asylum applications. And secondly, because the volume of people that have been affected by this is so great, that to lift it, I think would just cause chaos. And so I think that even if you have a government that wants to undo some of this, I think it's going to take a long time for that to be undone. And I don't think it's going to be practical or feasible. And I don't think that you would have the congressional or the administrative support to simply lift these restrictions either and go back to the way things were before, or to move to something that's that's kind of comparable to how things were before.
Fascinating, fascinatingly depressing, actually, the way this whole thing is working its way
It
through.
is depressing, but I do think it's important to, when, you know, I mean, obviously we come to this as lawyers, right? So after we kind of spend our time kind of looking at this and freaking out about it and thinking how awful it is, then I think that the second part of our job is to try and figure out, well, you know, how can we effectively, you know, is there anything that we can do for people in this situation? And the answer is yes, that there are various types of claims, in addition to claims for asylum, that people can make, despite the procedures I just talked about. Claims for withholding of removal, which are somewhat similar to asylum in key regards, but also different to asylum in other key regards. Claims for withholding of removal can still be made without regard to the Remain in Mexico or the Safe Third Country or the Asylum Cooperative Agreements. Likewise, for claims under the Torture Convention. Also, people who may be victims of severe forms of trafficking. Unfortunately, of course, people often don't know that they meet the definition of somebody who's been a victim of a severe form of trafficking. And of course, but you know, those restrictive procedures may not apply to them. And then also, I think that there are people to whom they may not apply simply on a case-by-case basis. And I think it does.
Right. If, you know, in a withholding situation, I can also, I mean, let me ask you this. Do you see a scenario where Congress could then step in and perhaps remove the 1-year issue from the books and make people eligible to file for asylum if they have a credible claim, notwithstanding the withholding?
I think, I mean, certainly Congress could do that. Do I see it happening? No. Just because I think that Congress is not going to undo anything that was in the Immigration Nationality Act before the Trump administration came into effect. I think what we're likely to see, if we do have a new Congress and a new government, is that maybe there would be some tightening and fine-tuning of how the statute is enacted to ensure that things like the Remain in Mexico policy and the Safe Third Country Agreement do not come into effect. And also, of course, even though I said that these have by and large been upheld by courts, I should point out that for each of these, various people have gone into court, represented by, you know, lots of public interest law firms, and they have obtained injunctions and restraining orders against these going into effect. And there's been a lot of litigation, and almost all of the litigation has been around the temporary restraining orders themselves and the injunctions themselves, not on whether the rule itself can ultimately take effect. So it is possible that over time that the Supreme Court will end up striking down some of this as being, you know, contrary to the statute. But for the moment, they're being allowed to, you know, to continue in effect. So, but like I say, one can hope that at some point, some of those are going to be stricken down by the courts. And maybe we will have a Congress that will, you know, rewrite or amend the asylum law to make things like Remain in Mexico the safe third country, to, you know, to basically outlaw those.
One can hope, Paul.
One can hope.
Can hope.
One can only hope, and one should not hope too much because you want to get disappointed. Said he cheerfully.
Thank you very much for your time this morning.
You're very welcome.
I know you're very busy. We're all very busy trying to live in these shelter-in-place orders and getting our clients' cases through and just really staying alive at this point.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
and that's what we have to do.
Yeah.
To fight another day.
Yes. Stay well, stay healthy.
Stay well, you too. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.